Have you ever talked to someone and felt like something was off? Not obvious, nothing dramatic, just a feeling. Maybe they answered too quickly. Maybe they smiled strangely. Maybe the story sounded right but didn't feel right. Hello and welcome back to Bookworm. Today we're diving into Spy the Lie, a book written by former intelligence officers who spent years studying deception. And according to them, people are constantly revealing more than they think because lying is stressful. Your brain has to invent information, hide the truth, stay believable, and somehow keep the story consistent. That pressure leaks out in words, in behavior, in tiny reactions most people completely miss. And once you learn these patterns, you start seeing them everywhere. Stay with me as we dive deeper because after this video, you may never hear conversations the same way again. And if you enjoy this kind of content, don't forget to like and subscribe.
All right, let's just jump right in. Have you ever walked away from a conversation with this nagging, inescapable feeling that someone wasn't being entirely truthful with you? You know the feeling. Maybe it was a coworker pitching a project, a salesperson pushing a deal, or honestly, even a family member. Well, today's explainer is going to completely rewire how you process human communication. We're going to decode the exact systematic framework developed by former CIA officers to detect deception in everyday life. We are moving way past those vague gut feelings and unreliable intuition. Instead, we're bringing in a structured, methodical toolkit that relies purely on actual behavioral observation. Now, the framework we're unpacking today wasn't just cooked up in some purely academic setting. It was forged in the incredibly high-stakes pressure cooker world of the Central Intelligence Agency. Philip Houston and his colleagues spent decades conducting polygraphs, security interviews, and deep intelligence debriefings. Over time, they developed this system, and it became so remarkably effective that it was eventually adopted across the entire intelligence and law enforcement communities. Now, it's even taught to corporate executives. So we're talking about a proven, battle-tested system that fundamentally shifts how we understand deception. And we really need to consider the sheer scale of the problem we're dealing with here. 10. Behavioral research suggests that the average person lies at least 10 times in a 24-hour period. Think about that for a second. 10 times a day. Now sure, many of those are your standard so-called white lies, the ones we tell to avoid minor conflict or just spare someone's feelings. But the psychological reality is crystal clear. People will lie to you if they believe it's in their best interest, and especially if they think they can get away with it. When you think about it, the stakes of not being able to spot those lies can be incredibly high, both personally and professionally. So here is our roadmap for this explainer. We're covering, first, why we believe lies. Second, the CIA deception model. Third and fourth, what deception actually sounds and looks like. And finally, spotting everyday deception.
Okay, starting with Section 1, why we believe lies and how we overcome our own built-in biases.
See, before we can spot a liar, we honestly have to recognize our own vulnerabilities. As humans, we inherently want to believe people. We naturally assume innocence until proven guilty. When we're placed in a position where we might have to label someone a liar, it causes us severe psychological discomfort. And because we want to believe them so badly, we lean on behavioral myths to spot lies. You know the stereotypes. We think, oh, they wouldn't look me in the eye, or they looked really nervous. But general anxiety has a million different causes. Maybe they're just intimidated by you. Even the incredibly popular concept of baselining, where you establish someone's normal behavior to look for deviations, is actually fundamentally flawed. Why? Because a smart person will just gain the baseline questions. Instead of relying on stereotypes, we need to focus purely on reliable indicators. We're looking for specific, observable behavioral changes and leakage cues that are strictly tied to timing and clusters. Moving on to Section 2, the CIA deception model and the core concept of the deception paradox. To filter out the noise of truth and actually spot a lie, you absolutely have to understand the deception paradox. This counterintuitive principle means you must actually ignore truthful behavior. Why? Because truthful behavior is incredibly easy for a deceptive person to fake. Instead, you have to enter what the authors call L-squared mode. This literally means actively telling your brain to look and listen at the exact same time. It sounds simple, right? But it actually requires intense, deliberate focus. Human communication is vastly nonverbal. Yet we usually just coast along, passively listening to the words. When you ask a high-stakes question, you must intentionally trigger this L-squared mode, so your visual and auditory channels are processing data simultaneously, actively hunting for verbal and nonverbal deceptive behaviors that act in concert. Now, when you're locked into L-squared mode, you have to apply the first really critical guideline: timing. Specifically, we're talking about the 5-second rule. Any deceptive behavior you observe absolutely must begin within the first 5 seconds after your question, which we call the stimulus. Here's why that is so absolutely crucial. The human brain thinks at least 10 times faster than we speak. If a bizarre behavior occurs, say, 30 seconds after you ask a question, their brain has likely already moved on to thinking about what's for dinner. It's completely unrelated. But if it happens within those crucial first 5 seconds, you can confidently link that specific behavior directly to the stress and cognitive load caused by your question. And that brings us to the second guideline, which is the rule of clusters. You have to remember this. A single odd behavior means absolutely nothing. If someone rubs their nose, maybe their nose just itches. You just ignore it. But a cluster is any combination of 2 or more deceptive indicators, and they can be verbal or nonverbal, occurring in response to your stimulus. A single indicator is just a quirk, but a cluster of 2 or more indicators, that dramatically raises the likelihood that you are dealing with deception. It shows the system is overloaded. Let's look at how a cluster plays out in everyday practice. Imagine a parent asks a really simple question. Did you do your homework? Within the first 5 seconds, the child responds with a question of their own. What homework? Okay, that's indicator number 1, a verbal stall. Then they shift their anchor point, maybe shuffling their feet. That's indicator 2. They close their eyes while speaking, indicator 3. Then they finally say, I always do my homework, which is indicator 4, a convincing statement. And while they say it, they adjust their shirt collar, which is indicator 5, a classic grooming gesture. That is a massive cluster. The intense cognitive load and the stress of the lie cause their entire system to essentially short circuit, unintentionally leaking all these hidden pieces of information through their behavior, all within that 5-second window. Which leads us perfectly into section 3, what deception sounds like. Let's break down these verbal indicators. When the facts just aren't an ally, people rely on a few specific strategies. They use lies of omission, leaving things out, lies of commission, just making things up completely, or influence, where they try to manipulate your perception. All verbal deceptive behaviors basically stem from those 3 strategies. For example, they might just completely fail to answer the question you actually asked, giving you this confusing non-answer instead. Or, and this is a big one, they might repeat your question back to you. The math behind this is actually fascinating. It takes them maybe 3 seconds to say the question back to you. But remember, because their brain processes information 10 times faster than they speak, repeating the question just bought them about 30 seconds of invisible cognitive processing time to construct a believable lie. Other times, they'll give overly specific answers, just bombarding you with unnecessary detail to create this sort of halo effect of transparency.
But perhaps the most powerful verbal indicator of all is the convincing statement. When someone says, I swear on a stack of Bibles, or I am a completely honest person, they are attempting to manage your perception. They're overcompensating. They're trying way too hard to appear believable, dressing up the lie in its Sunday best. Think about it. A truthful person simply relies on the facts. They just say, no, I didn't do it. A deceptive person doesn't have the facts to lean on, so they have to convince you of their inherent goodness instead. It is a massive red flag.
All right, section 4, what deception looks like. Let's talk about the nonverbal leakage cues. This is where we completely abandon those global body language guessing games. We are only looking for specific, inconsistent reactions occurring immediately after the question. Honestly, we don't care if their arms are crossed. Maybe the room is just cold. Instead, we are looking for things like a behavioral pause, this unnatural, heavy silence before they speak. We're looking for verbal and nonverbal disconnects. Like someone saying yes while their head is subtly shaking no. We're also looking for people hiding their mouth or eyes. If a person's hand covers their mouth as they speak, or they close their eyes for a prolonged moment while answering a super simple question, it's actually a subconscious attempt to literally shield themselves from your reaction to the lie they're telling. And understanding the actual biology behind these nonverbals, particularly hand-to-face activity, is so key here. Have you ever wondered why liars constantly touch their face, or bite their lips, or pull at their ears? Well, when you ask a threatening question, it spikes their anxiety and it triggers the autonomic nervous system. That's your classic fight or flight response. When that happens, the body immediately reroutes blood flow away from the extremities in the face, sending it straight to the major muscle groups so they can literally fight or run away. This rapid draining of blood from the face actually irritates the capillaries, creating a literal physical sensation of cold or itchiness. Without even realizing it, their hands are drawn to their face to soothe that itch. It is literally their biology betraying the lie.
Finally, Section 5, Spotting Everyday Deception, and how to apply this safely in real life.
This brings us to a really vital question. Can you definitively call someone a liar just because you saw a cluster of indicators within 5 seconds? The answer is absolutely 100% no. We are not human lie detectors. What this framework actually does is highlight problem areas. A cluster of indicators is basically a giant flashing neon sign that says, warning, the facts are not their ally here. It tells you that this specific topic requires more probing, more questions, and deeper investigation. You can't rely on intuition alone without this careful observation. And when you do decide to probe deeper, you must absolutely avoid a trap called psychological entrenchment. If you suspect someone is lying, the absolute worst thing you can do in an everyday situation or an interrogation is aggressively hammer them with the exact same question over and over again. If you force a person to repeatedly verbalize a lie, they are going to dig their heels in. It becomes a matter of pride and survival. With every single repetition, they become more entrenched in the falsehood, and they actually become a better, much more confident liar. You have to navigate around the lie. You ask different open-ended questions to gather facts without triggering their defensive walls. Ultimately, what you're constantly looking for is this core contrast. Truthful responses are direct, spontaneous, and anchored in facts. Truthful people naturally just want the facts known. Deceptive responses, on the other hand, carry immense cognitive load. Their brain is working absolute overtime to juggle the truth, construct the fake story, and frantically monitor your reaction. Because of this massive internal stress, deceptive people rely on those influence tactics, and they constantly leak unintended messages through their behavior and language. As Thomas Jefferson so perfectly observed, lying is a very slippery slope. Once permitted, it becomes habitual. And that is exactly why this framework is so incredibly empowering. Deception creates predictable psychological stress, and that stress physically manifests in observable behavioral patterns. By understanding this, you're no longer just relying on a hunch or a stereotype. You are systematically observing the physical and verbal habits of deception, which massively improves your everyday perception and communication. So, I want to leave you with this final provocative thought. The next time you sit down for a tough negotiation, or you ask your teenager about their weekend, or you're interviewing a new hire, are you just going to casually listen to the words, or will you actively turn on your L-squared vision? How are you going to use this methodical toolkit to see the unseen in your very next conversation?
If there's one idea to take from this book, it's this. People rarely hide lies perfectly. Spy the Lie shows that deception creates pressure, and pressure changes behavior. A pause, a strange reaction, too much detail, not enough detail. Small things, but meaningful things. The problem is, most people never notice them because we listen to words instead of observing behavior. But awareness changes that. Once you start paying attention to patterns, reactions, and inconsistencies, you begin seeing communication differently, not with paranoia, with awareness. And that awareness is powerful. If this made you rethink how people communicate, like the video, subscribe to Bookworm and stay observant, because sometimes the truth isn't hidden very well.